All right, everybody, my name is Katrin Chappelle. I'm Associate Director of the Water Policy Center at PPIC, and I am thrilled to continue the conversation that we just had with our next panel, Innovating to Tackle Tough Challenges. I think we're going to build nicely on some of the topics that came up in the previous panel. Our vision for the next hour is to discuss how innovation in policy, practice, and technology can lead to progress in some of our most pressing water management challenges. Sometimes the water profession can have a reputation for being slow to make progress, archaic, and siloed, but I don't think that is necessarily true. In this field, I've seen many innovative solutions, from forward-looking statewide policies to new smart technologies that have disrupted and improved the way we use, see, and talk about water. So when we talk about innovation, beyond the simple definition of a new idea, device, or method, what I'm hoping our panelists can inform and talk to you all about today is how the advancement of creative solutions can help tackle future challenges, unlock new value in our organizations, and close data and information gaps. And as Ellen laid out this morning, challenges, we have a few. Climate change pressures are fundamentally stressing our water management system. We have hundreds of communities that don't have access to safe and reliable drinking water. Many freshwater species are on the brink of extinction, and California farmers are facing less reliable supplies and overdrafted groundwater basins. But as Ellen also mentioned, promoting innovation and collaboration could be a cornerstone of our new governor's approach to water, and we think he'll agree to our recommendation because he's literally written a book on the subject. In 2013, his book Citizenville was about how Governor-elect Gavin Newsom's 2013 book, Citizenville, he wrote about how government can be better, more relevant, and more engaged with the public on a range of issues by embracing technology and innovation. Our panelists today all come from diverse backgrounds and are all working in diverse areas of water management, just like our audience. And before I introduce them, just a reminder that there's lots more information about them and the agendas in their bios. So I'm going to quickly introduce them. Today we have Joaquin Esquivel, who was appointed to the State Water Resources Control Board in March 2017. Cherie Peterson, who's Program Director of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers South Pacific Division. Robin Grimm, Senior Manager of Water Information Systems at the Environmental Defense Fund. And finally, down at the end, Eiji Kawamura, who is owner and partner of Orange County Produce, co-chair of Solutions from the Land, and of course, former Secretary of the California Department of Food and Agriculture. Thank you all for being here today. The way I'm going to structure this is I'm going to go down the line asking questions to each of you about specific innovations and technologies related to topics that you all work on, and then we'll have a broader discussion on how innovation can reduce costs, promote equity, and lead to better water management. And then we will also do a lightning round, asking them about policy priorities for the new governor, and then turn to all of you for questions. All right, let me catch up on my paper. Okay, Joaquin, I'm going to start with you. As a member of the state's largest regulatory agency when it comes to water, some might think you were an interesting choice for a panel on innovation, but I don't think that's true, because I remember the first conversation you and I had over dinner pretty soon after you were appointed, in which you talked about how you believe regulation can help, shouldn't stand in the way of creative solutions, and in a perfect world, help to spur them. So I know it's an important topic for you. And so the topic I wanted to ask you specifically about today is an issue that I know many folks think is one of the most urgent ones facing the state, and that's ensuring that all Californians have access to safe and reliable drinking water. And I know it's been a priority of the State Water Board during this last administration to try and tackle that challenge. So my specific question is, how can local agencies in the state work together to use both institutional and technological innovations to start making a real difference on the ground for these communities? A lot of attention in the last couple years has been paid to finding sustainable funding sources for these problems. But my question specifically for you today is, assuming we can figure out a lot of the funding challenges, what role does innovation and technology play in actually deploying solutions quickly?
Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to join with a fantastic panel and what was a great first panel. I suppose we are sort of the gorilla in the room at the state board. You know, our regulatory authorities, as all you well know, are unique when it comes to states across the nation. being able to have a regulatory agency that has drinking water, that has water quality, that has water rights, makes for a pretty potent and unique combination of regulatory authorities. So I think sometimes it's, to your point, the real issue right now is how do we address a funding gap for these communities? We know that the O&M gap exists. We know that is key to really solving this. But absent that, there is a lot of great work out there, and it has been a priority of this board to try to address it. And it's less, I think, at this point, a matter of what additional authorities we need, but how do we use those? And to the point that was made by Lorelei earlier, that urbanized South LA has a lot in common when it comes to rural California, particularly, it's obviously particularly true when we talk about access to clean and safe drinking water. But the tools that you're going to use in urban LA are going to be very different than the tools we're going to use in the Central Valley. And so, a question and an issue for us at the board, obviously, is how do you develop a program implementation that gets us to fulfill the human right to water? Another unique characteristic of this state when we talk about being the first state in the nation to recognize a human right to water, and has spurred so much of the incredible discussion. So we, as a regulatory agency, we have our authorities. I think, to your point, and it's a point that I've made before, the legislature, we can hope in the next session, can address this funding gap that we know exists, that will really charge efforts when it comes to ensuring all Californians have access to clean and safe drinking water. But if it had already passed, if the last legislature had acted, we'd be in the middle of having a discussion of what that program implementation looks like. And that's something that doesn't have to be, we don't have to wait for action. And so it does become a question of what are those tools? How do we approach these communities? We know regionalization, consolidation is one of those tools. We have mandatory consolidation authorities, but if we have to go into every single one of those communities and mandatory consolidate, I mean, we will be here for a long while. So it's less about how we as a board express our authorities in a sort of command and control way on this issue particularly, but how do we incentivize voluntary consolidation? And so this is where data really comes key. This is where information becomes empowering, insofar as allowing communities themselves to understand their systems, where their opportunities for collaboration are, where there are opportunities to maybe bundle services, much like you look at many of the small cities in urban Southern California, and you can't afford your own fire department, you can't afford your own police department, can't afford these services, so you contract out in common amongst you as systems. And so there are models. There was a Caballero bill as well that tried to say, well, how do you stand up regionalized sort of entities that can do these things? So and then when it comes to the technology itself, how what your filtration train looks like on your drinking water system to handle your unique sort of issues, whether it's nitrate or arsenic or 1,2,3 TCP. Those are out. I don't think that's the issue. I think that it is how do you get that technical and managerial capacity for those systems to identify those, and then again the funding gap be taken care of from there. So I hope that kind of gets to some of it.
It's a good start. We'll come back to it, I'm sure. Cherie, I was thrilled to get somebody from the Army Corps on our panel because you have such a unique, not that it was hard, but you have such a unique and specific role to play in water management in California, and a role that I think will become more crucial as the climate changes. So I'm going to ask you to describe for the audience the role that better weather and climate forecasting is playing in improving flood control and water supply operations with the Army Corps and your local partners.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting us. We're the government, we're here to help, right? So on water management, I think there's this sort of outdated, almost cartoonish idea that all of the operations that we have, there's some crusty old guy sitting there, and it's like, oh, it's November 15th, I gotta hike up my pants and open up my water manual, and this is what I can do. There are some like that, but in fact, they offer a lot of experience in addition to just what's in the manual. But as weather forecasting improved, we really started taking advantage of it, first at Warm Springs Dam, which is like Mendocino, not too far from here, with a partnership with Scripps, the National Weather Service, of course the Sonoma County Water Agency, and then ourselves, is to how can we make the most of the improving information. And part of what I think was the risk was not that just the weather forecasting is getting better, but how is it getting better? Is it getting better in timing, or is it getting better in amount? And what we're finding out is the timing was, I would say, also in place. The timing and the amount were fairly good. The where, of course, was always the trick. You know, you have the weatherman forecasting weather the night before, and you walk outside your door and it's sunny. But then the next town over is wet. So how do we improve that and then use it for what we do? And so they came up with a model working together, and still there was sort of uncomfortableness because of the risk of flooding, obviously, is quite great because of these large atmospheric river events we have. So these two grad students through Scripps really made a huge leap forward, frankly, by looking back. It's a new term to me. It's called hindcasting, where they take the model that they've developed to look for future operations, but they take the data from the last 50 years, they apply it to the model and see if the model accurately predicted what in fact occurred, because you compare it against actual results. The surprising news was for a non-event, they were 100% accurate. Now, non-event doesn't sound that exciting, but a non-event means we can store more water because we're not releasing water for a flood. So because of that really kind of somewhat extraordinary conclusion for water managers, we have a major deviation in place for Warm Springs Dam that will be in place for 3 to 4 years so that we can operate in accordance with what we think the data is telling us. And we think we're going to be very successful for that, then we'll be able to change our water control manual to incorporate all of these for permanent. We don't have to do a deviation every few years, which I think is how we've been operating. We've incorporated some of these lessons, actually many of these lessons learned, into the operations of the Joint Federal Project at Folsom. That operation manual will be shortly concluded. We're also working on it at Prado Dam down in Southern California, and we're starting to work with the state and other users on dams we don't control, which is, in this case, would be Oroville and New Bullet Dam, and how we can incorporate some of this. But that hindcasting was sort of a revelation to how we can use dams. The second one was called ensemble forecasting. So I'm not a weather forecaster. I don't know anything about it other than what I hear from ABC7 AccuWeather Forecast. But it turns out there are 26 weather forecasting models used nationwide, and ensemble forecasting is using them all to sort of create an average as to amount of water and where, and it really improves your accuracy. So these two innovations are really going to help us as we move forward in operating so that we can store more water during a drought, but then also prepare better within 2 to 3 days if we do see the atmospheric river coming and it is going to hit our location and the data is telling us we need to release some water so that we can safely protect those both above the water retention, whatever it is, and down below. So it's by understanding better the kind of information we need, being able to communicate it through the partnership so they could develop models, data, and give it back to us so that we can make policy decisions was as much of an innovation as just the hindcasting and the ensemble forecast. So it has really been a great opportunity, and we're proud to be here and to help.
Great. Robin, building on the idea of more information, currently you're working with partners at NASA, the Desert Research Institute, and Google Earth Engine to create an open platform for estimating consumptive water use. And can you quickly tell us more about that project, and even more importantly, the solutions you're hoping to advance with the work?
Yes, sure. And thank you also for having me here. I'm honored by the company I'm keeping and the other panels. I think I want to start with a little bit of higher level context setting, which is just to make the point that we all kind of understand that data can be really powerful. But it can be powerful in both negative and positive ways, right? It can be the source of a lot of conflict and sort of help people further entrench themselves and lob numbers at one another. Or it can be really powerful as a tool for community building and consensus building and finding common ground and ways to collaborate on really innovative solutions, to the point that Joaquin made earlier. And so I think it's really important to recognize that with these innovations and sort of decision-making tools and data that we're trying to bring into play to improve water management, that we're not thinking just about the information gap that exists, but also about ensuring that the data is really valuable and beneficial, which of course is only relative to the extent that it's broadly trusted and considered valid by sort of all stakeholders across the spectrum. And so to that end, I'll speak a little bit more about OpenET now. The project is called OpenET. Katrin described it as a way to make data about consumptive use more broadly accessible. The ET portion of the title is for evapotranspiration, which is a measure of consumptive use for irrigated agriculture and some other non-urban landscapes. And we're sitting in this reality that was brought up in the previous panel where we are faced with the need to conserve more. And that's going to be asking a lot of partners, especially in the agricultural sector. And so we think it's really critical that we're providing all the tools and information necessary to really enable some innovation at the local scale around how best to cope with that reality in a way that allows for the sustainability of agriculture in the state while also allowing that water is available in times of drought and scarcity for other beneficial uses. So where in terms of the information gap, that is the information gap we're trying to solve for here. We don't really have the equivalent of a smart water meter for agriculture in the way that we do have in the urban setting. And if you think about all the types of conservation programs and really successful solutions that have been employed in the urban setting that depend on a meter, that depend on that ability to really accurately measure use at a small spatial scale, you can see there's potentially a host of solutions there's sort of a barrier there because that information is lacking on the agricultural side. And so I can speak to a few different examples, and maybe we'll get to that in a bit. But I think equally important for us in this effort, both at EDF and for all the partners that are involved, some of who you mentioned, is that trust building and community building aspect of the project. And so, we're hoping that this not only is enabling from the perspective of sort of policy setting at the state and even local water management levels, but more importantly to us, I think, is that it's empowering from a really local standpoint, and that it allows growers and landowners on the ground to really quantify the benefits that they're achieving through their investments towards conservation, to get credit for those achievements, and then further to participate more actively in some of these programs that might be being developed at the GSA scale or even up to the state level. So if you think about that in the Sigma context, where folks working in GSAs are looking to develop these types of programs, you can't really initiate a trading program. It's really difficult to set up any kind of sort of conservation incentive program without having a way to measure use and sort of track change and track benefit of investment towards that intended outcome on the ground. So we think that this can be really transformative in allowing a lot of local innovation around how best to do that, but also building kind of the trust and common understanding around that really critical piece of information, how much water is being used, when, and for how long. And so, and in the trust building side of things, we're really hoping that by spending a lot of time on the front end of the project and bringing in all the perspectives of the voices and bringing people into the room who are actually going to be affected by the numbers and who we hope will use the information from the get-go, that we're building something that's actually useful while also kind of addressing potential concerns about how that data gets used by other players going forward. So hopefully that was a bit of a rambling answer, but hopefully that got to your question.
You did great. All right, building on information in the farming sector, AGR, I want to move to you. The work you're focusing on now is about making the farming sector more climate resilient. And so can you spend a few minutes describing how your organization is tackling that and what role technology and innovation plays in building resilience, managing costs, and also reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
Sure, thank you, Katrin, and thank you, PPIC, for this opportunity to share some thoughts and to be with this great panel. For those of us in agriculture, it's been a struggle these past few years, maybe a struggle for a lifetime. I could bring my violin out or my cello, but I'll put it away because the truth is we're really experiencing and believing in really transformative, exciting times. I oftentimes talk about an agricultural renaissance that is really we're at the front end of because of the enormous amount of opportunities when we have alignment with the sector that eats every day, which is all of us. So this concept of collaborative alignment is really important. Can I just ask a quick question? How many of you have ever seen and read and had a good chance to digest the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations? Just a show of hands. I wish the day comes very shortly where everybody's hand goes up. The Sustainable Development Goals is an outstanding list of 17 goals, like the Millennial Goals that the United Nations came out with in the 80s and were accomplished at the year 2000. This set of goals is 17 goals, and within them there's, I like to say, 7, 8, 9 goals that have a lot to do with agriculture. And the most important part of that is if agriculture is not doing well, we can't accomplish these goals on the planet, including ending hunger and some of the other more important things that you would attach with that. But side by side with it is really water development and the ability to have water for all. So in the fact that there's not everybody's hand went up, that's, I think, a first place to start. There's an infrastructure that we want to work towards, that we want to build if we're going to have this vibrant world in the future with 10 billion people, 9 billion people on the planet. It's important to understand that we're not prepared today for that future, but we know that. We had a water bill that didn't pass, Proposition 3rd. We have the water fix bill kind of pending to be moving forward. This idea that we can build resilient, if you will, climate smart infrastructure, that we in agriculture conduct ourselves in a way that moves us towards a much more multi-benefit kind of activity. This idea that we have ecosystem benefits, that we sequester carbon, that we enhance the environment with biodiversity. All of these things is the direction that agriculture is moving today. And you might not think so, but you only have to take a step back to see where we've been in a lifetime to where we are today, more importantly where we're going very rapidly. The ability to have so much knowledge means that you have to be able to use the knowledge. And the experience that I know that I felt, the simple example I give in this last drought, I farm in 3 different watersheds down in Southern California. In year 3 of the drought, I had a well and it went dry because it was a very shallow aquifer, and if that had been my only farm, I would have been out of business. And I leased the property, by the way. In another watershed just further north, in year 4 and 5, that we saw the salt starting to rise, and we farmed very close to the ocean, and we had saltwater intrusion starting to take out well by well, and if that had been my only farm, I would have been out of business. In the middle of that, and someone mentioned SAPA, the Santa Ana watershed, in the middle of that, I have been using for over 35 years reclaimed water because very brilliant people have put together an enormous system down there in Southern California to anticipate a shortage of water. And because of that reclaimed water, water reuse, and eventually maybe it's potable water reuse, because of that investment in technology, infrastructure, and knowledge about how your watershed works, I was unaffected by the drought, other than we had some rising salts. But my point is, I'm a fairly innovative, fairly progressive farmer, and yet in 2 out of 3 farms I would have been out of business in year 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 of a sustained drought. When we saw what happened to Australia in their 10-year drought and watched the collapse of their agricultural economy by 50% and the shutting down of many communities, it frightened us, but that was 7, 8 years ago that we went down there and saw that. We still haven't then really responded with this need to take the knowledge, take the experience, don't wait for the perfect plan, but get moving on an infrastructure that's resilient, smart, and smarter all the time because we can improve upon it once it's built. But the idea that we have been stalling and not, we do a lot of think tanks. I'm not a big fan of think tanks these days, sorry, but I like the idea of a do tank. I like the idea of doing things. I like the idea of taking dollars, getting bang for the buck, and getting response. So we're in an exciting place, but we need action. We need to start to do things and build things, because sure enough, we're going to end up suffering for every year that we delay. So
building directly on that, I'd like to just ask all of you to spend a little time talking about what incentives are needed to do more, to take down some of those barriers and obstacles, and what is needed to accommodate more creative solutions within each of your fields, whether that's statewide policy or whether that's just more trust building within communities.
I think cooperation is a big part of it. You know, again, obviously having such broad regulatory sort of oversight over things, you know, the board can sometimes not necessarily be welcomed into conversations. But I think that belies what is the history of the boards, which is we are a data-driven organization. And just to quickly, you know, touch back on a point, you know, I think sometimes it's less about what more data do we need, but how do we turn that data into information, into actionable things. And so we as an organization, we rely on data. We are nothing but data. We are data-driven decision-making at a local level. You know, as you all know, we have 9 regional water quality control boards. They are semi-autonomous, so they are composed themselves of locals. They're a public board, and we have nothing but public process and transparency. So to the extent that we need to begin to think about our institutions in ways, leverage them to continue to provide the space to have the discussions, to foster the cooperation, and to the extent, again, that we have the regulatory responsibility on water quality, on administering the water rights system, on ensuring drinking water regulations are being met. I think, you know, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, and it is sometimes a matter of who the messenger is. To AG's point, you know, it is interesting. You look across the state, and each community, and we're reminded this at the board often, is unique unto itself. It's hard to craft statewide policies that are able to blanket everyone, but the investments that SAPA has made, the investments that the region has made, you see have made them more resilient. And so the question becomes, how do you then turn data into information? How do you create those institutions that allow for the discussion and collaboration? And you have that. You have SAPA. And so I think that's what that is what you know, sort of stands out. So again, to the extent that we at the boards are based off of, you know, transparency, public process, we can't do anything that's not in the public eye. You know, how do we then leverage then those other organizations that are out there that are also working on them, and come to see us as allies in our regulatory roles? And you know, I always like to say, so much of the focus of my work is, you know, what does a 21st century regulatory agency look like? And it's, you know, it's a different skill set, and it's a skill set that, you know, this also dovetails into issues of workforce development. And I was very glad Denise delved into issues of equity around that, because the silver tsunami is coming. So we have these opportunities to bring greater voices into these discussions, to, you know, have our institutions look more like the communities they serve, and really energize all of this. And again, it comes down to what are the institutions that we can rely on that allow us to understand and collaborate. So.
Can I just build on that point of the importance of collaboration? And I want to make a point about funding, which is maybe an expected answer, but the point I want to make is maybe a little bit nuanced, which is that a lot of funding for innovation and data and sort of decision support tools is competitive in nature, which is great at the outset, right? But eventually it leads to a lot of sort of disparate black box solutions that are competing with one another, and numbers that don't match and that compete with one another. And so at some point, you know, and those competing solutions sometimes take advantage of inherent scientific uncertainties to sort of further entrench the different viewpoints and continue to compete in that space. And so I think it's really important that we think about how we structure funding for a lot of these efforts, such that from the very get-go, one of the intended outcomes at some point needs to be to create consensus within the scientific community, within the thought leaders that are out there around these approaches that people are taking to answer some of these really critical information questions. And that's, you know, with the Open ET project, I think we have a good example there where luckily we have a set of funders that recognize that as being one of the biggest issues out there when it came to consumptive use information on water, was that there were so many different ways of getting at the answer that all somewhat competed with each other, and made it an explicit intended outcome of the project from the get-go that we try to solve for that. And so, we're doing that by bringing a lot of the foremost thought leaders in that space together on one team and bringing all those different models and algorithms together on one platform. But I think that's something that's not spoken a lot about in terms of funding, and it's a really critical issue if we want to do the trust building aspect of modernizing our data and decision support tools for water management.
Shri, I'd love your thoughts on this, because I know that investing in that technology is what led to where you are now. So what do you see as the next frontier, and what do you need to get even more precise with decision making when it comes to the dam operations?
Part of it will be an improvement just in forecasting itself, because there are limits right now with, and the Weather Service, I don't think they would disagree, that there are limits right now into what we can and cannot predict, particularly in regard to location. So that will have to improve. I think one of the reason that people bring the Corps of Engineers to any of their project is because we invest in large infrastructure, which isn't always necessarily the most innovative kind of infrastructure. But I think as an agency, what we are learning, which seems like we should have learned this a long time ago, but we are learning it even more so now, that our partners have as much, many of them have as much experience in the engineering and have a little bit more freedom to do innovation than our laws or policies or regulations will allow us to do, and giving them more opportunities to either build the project for us or with us. How do we look at creative financing so that it's not just, here's my share, here's your share, we're going to do this together, but perhaps there's a private sector interest in doing so. So we're sort of looking at innovation from all aspects, not just technologically what we can do, but as well as construction, but how do we as partners work together better? I know that's sort of a theme on this panel, a little bit of a theme on the last panel, but it's, when you get to these large infrastructure projects, there are better ways to build a levee, but there are only so many ways to build a levee. So that the people living behind them have the protection that really is in the interest of both the state, the local, and the Corps of Engineers as well. Certainly, we've had a lot of disasters in other parts of the country in the last couple years that have pointed out to weaknesses in our infrastructure, or even weaknesses in the understanding of our infrastructure and what it is designed to do and what it is designed not to do. So helping everybody understand that better and working with our partners, I think, is a lot of where that innovation is going to come from.
AG, before we get to our lightning round, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would. I would continue to say that government can certainly be incentive-driven, a carrot instead of a stick, and base itself on what are we trying to accomplish. And when you go back to look at best practices or new practices that can be easily scaled up, easily replicated, there's a lot of opportunity then to see the transformation take place, because you're working, and I agree, within different watersheds. This nexus between water, energy, and food is, I think, the way we start to have to look at this, the future going forward, that they're all involved together and they all can help each other. 1 + 1 = 3, if you will, or 1 + 1 = 4. The idea that we're kind of stalled, if you will, on a tremendous jump forward is frustrating. But I think because the pump has been primed, because I think you're starting to see an entire new generation of new thinkers come on in and say, as you mentioned, the old fellow that thinks that we used to always do it this way. Institutional knowledge is critical, but now we marry it together with this new way of looking, a new vision, if you will. You put on a different set of glasses, your vision changes, add some imagination. I think that's what I see happening. And to hold it back or to restrict it is, I think, our biggest challenge. Someone mentioned atmospheric water harvesters over here. And what's exciting about that is they work. They could be scaled down to the household level. They could be scaled up to an industrial level because it's pure water. And then you get to dilution as the solution, and you're able to move that water into any number of places, working with brackish water and suddenly taking the minerals out and having your own fertilizer program of NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium out of the brackish water, where the byproduct is water, and the commercial product is fertilizer. These are the kind of exciting transformative technologies that are available right now, driven by information, driven by new science. So we're in an exciting place.
Okay, great. Gavin Newsom has walked across the street, and now he's in a building with all of you, and you get to ride the elevator with him. So we'll go down, maybe we'll start with AG and go this way. We'll switch it up. If you could ride in an elevator with our new governor and pitch him one policy priority related to water and innovation, what would it be? Go.
Ready? Governor-elect Newsom, congratulations. I believe that you're a big thinker in terms of seeing the world in a 21st century framework. And if that is true, it would be wonderful if you would embrace, as the goal for California, those sustainable development goals and become the first subnational region on the planet to accomplish all those goals, arguably by 2030. If it's later, it's later. But once you accomplish those goals, California can then become the 4th largest economy in the world, because you'll have everybody aligned, collaboratively working towards something that's bigger than all of us.
Robin?
I would say, Governor Newsom, as I think you've already recognized, it's important that we more highly prioritize data, decision support, and information technology as a critical point or component of modernizing the state's water infrastructure, and not to mention a relatively cheap component of modernizing the state's water infrastructure, not just for the sake of policy setting at the state level, but also for the sake of really enabling and empowering local communities to come together and stop arguing about the numbers and get down to the solution making.
So my message to the Governor-elect Newsom would be, we need, as much as we need innovation and we need all the stakeholders to own it, we also need the stakeholders to own the risk, because inevitably some of the innovations aren't going to work out. And what we want to be able to do is, if all the stakeholders are bought in on the innovation and the risk, that we own the failure together. We're not pointing fingers, we're not suing each other, we're not hiding behind regulations. We're learning the lessons and we're moving on to the next innovation. And then I would ask for his autograph, please.
Not his picture? You're old school. Not a selfie? Joaquin?
I think I'm in the wrong elevator. I gotta go. I think first it would be we struggle, not just our agency, but all state agencies with IT. It's hard to recruit good people. We lose them to Silicon Valley. We don't pay nearly enough. And so we need, and our procurement processes are, abhorrent. So there needs to be a big rethink there, and he should, maybe focus on the Department of Technology. I would also pivot slightly and then say, the California Water Action Plan and what this administration did insofar as bringing together Department of Agriculture, Resources Agency, Cal EPA, everybody, and really, and the drought, emphasized the need for that certainly, but you need to have that crosstalk. You have to have that coordination. It isn't just about any one agency's, roles and responsibilities. It is, again, how to, folks on the outside don't care. State government is state government. We are but one entity, especially to the public's mind. So to the extent that he can get those conversations going early, create a great team that cross cuts across all the agencies, I think is going to be really key. So that's all.
Great. All right. So now it's your turn to ask our panelists questions. Just like before, we have folks with mics who are walking around, and I'll point, if I can see you, to you. Here at PPIC, we love questions in the form of questions, so please try to get there as quickly as you can so we can hear from as many folks as possible. Right here.
Good morning. Dave Bredinger with Mountain Counties Water Resources Association. Enjoyed all of your comments up there, and thank you for being here. I'm going to look a little bit more to maybe ask for a follow-up with the Corps of Engineers, with Sherry. We all in this area know very much about the importance of Folsom. We're really pleased with the integrity improvements that have occurred. We really love our local officials who work on the flood control boards. Can you speak a bit more on how the coordination is with downstream below the dam? Let's take Folsom, because that's what we're here. And I've got, since the 70s, pretty good experience of the kinds of climate storms we get, atmospheric rivers, Pineapple Express. the importance of being able to release water early enough so it doesn't overtop the levees. Usually there's a maximum of the American River and the levees along the Sacramento, and when we tend to have these, there's a wind event. Usually it's January, February, but not always. The tides are much higher than normal. We get a significant in height added to the delta. But my point is, how do we help everyone get better together? It's one element to say we release water out of the dam, but invariably there's some weak system, usually it's some levee. How do we make this work better together? What do you do on collaboration that you mentioned earlier? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for that softball question. No, it's a very serious question. And for the first time, when we did this operations manual, since we had both the funding and we knew well in advance what we were going to do, we actually consulted with over 200 stakeholders, both upstream and downstream, as to how we were going to operate this facility. So that was really a first for our organization to better incorporate the needs. But it is very serious, the quality of the levees downstream, because clearly some of them meet the federal standards that could handle the maximum release of Folsom, but many of them don't. So how do we slow down our operations, or excuse me, slow down our releases in terms of doing it far enough in advance? So part of that is in the operations manual and the improved water weather forecasting so that we can see these events. If we can have 3 to 4 days notice, we are, in most cases, not just Folsom, we are able to get down to the levels that we need to do. 2 to 3 days is tougher, but we can manage it with the capacity of our levees. Less than that, then we're in a very dangerous situation with some of our levees, maybe not necessarily the federal levees, but some of the levees further down the system, because we're certainly not interested in only protecting part of the citizens in our state, but all of them. So it's a delicate thing. Part of it is really, I have to give a shout out to Congress for a change. They gave us a supplemental funding, which has allowed huge investments in California, almost $2 billion in our infrastructure. A lot of it can be federally paid first and paid back over 30 years to the local sponsor. Some of it doesn't have to be paid back at all. So we are going to be able to invest, particularly along the American River, but in other places as well, where we just hadn't seen that kind of funding in a while. So multifold answer.
Great. Back here, right here.
Thank you. So question for Joaquin, and actually I guess anyone on the panel. So data is great, modeling is great, having as a stakeholder better data and information to that is always helpful. But what happens when data disagrees, when models disagree? We see that all the time. There's a lot of very smart people with PhDs and alphabet soups next to their name who disagree. But it seems like the tie always tends to go to State Water Board. Is there anything that internal stakeholders are doing to try and expand what that data sets look like and where those datas and those models are incorporated from?
Yeah, you hear a lot of talk about our science or our data. And yes, you get a lot of sort of conflicting information that sometimes it's just off of a lack of understanding about that information or those models or those data. There has been yet to be a moment where I'm necessarily a call on a specific model, but again, I think it does speak to, how are you, you look at OpenET, how are you building support for common decision support tools? How are you, developing the work? Right now, so I can point to, say, Siskiyou County, where, as you know, due to recent court cases, we're looking at groundwater usage there and depletion of then rivers and the usage. And there's going to have to be some modeling work that we do to kind of understand the public trust obligations there. But Siskiyou County itself is going through SGMA right now, and they are doing their own. They have started down a path of doing modeling work with UC Davis. And so there is an example of, we're not looking to be duplicative in the work that we do. We as a regulatory agency, I think, always need to begin to say, well, what is the work that is already being done, and how do we become additive? So how do the resources of the board in say, this case in Siskiyou County become additive to them and help, drive sort of what is a need for this monumental shift in how we manage our resources? If I can really quick just take a step back and look outside of California, quick anecdotal story about South Bend, Indiana, a disadvantaged community, poor. They have a combined sewer stormwater system like many places in the East. A ton of overflows. EPA comes in, cease and desist order. They're being directed to spend about $700 million in gray infrastructure, holding tanks, pipes, et cetera, to stop these overflows from happening, these terrible water quality issues. The community is very distressed economically, cannot afford that, no matter what sort of rate increase you might try to force upon them. So the question is, what do they do? And so what they did do was invest in some soft things. So they, for the first time, got telemetry throughout their entire system. So they knew where wastewater was going when during storm events. They incorporated that into then, and what they found first and foremost is their operating models look nothing like what was actually happening on the ground. They were all, it was, so what they had been doing to operate their systems was, they didn't even know what was happening within it. So just getting that information, be able to run your system in real time, they were able to bring down their overflows to nearly zero. And it was in a time of increased precipitation, the biggest storms they'd ever seen. And just being able to put on the back end some machine learning where, it's an exchange system where the pumps, the storage tanks, they all know their levels. They're trying to figure out where to move water when different parts of the city get water at different times. So we talk about the sophistication of the operation of our infrastructure. And again, here's this one example where they've had huge benefits. And now that they know their system better, they're more sophisticated with what their actual operations are. It's, that 700 million is looking more like maybe 200, and it's more green infrastructure, and it's less, gray. But all that came from a shift, first and foremost, of just how they approach the work, how they approach what they're doing. And so we can take that lesson and apply it to watersheds. So, and I think that's going to be really, really critical. And so sorry, it's kind of a long way and maybe not so as direct about necessarily, conflicts directly in models and us calling what those conflicts are. Let's get away from that conflict to begin with and make sure that the investments that we're making are in these common decision support tools that, on a watershed basis can really have an incredible effect.
I would just like to add, I think this is where that term I used, hindcasting, can come to great effect because you have a model, maybe you have two models. You can test it against the data you have. I mean, it's not just the Corps that has data for 50 years. The state of California, locals often have even further back data. You can enter that data as if it were new and test the outcome against what actually happened, which is sort of get away from the who says what, but this is the more predictive model. So I think it has a lot of potential, and it's really the first time it's been used in a water infrastructure manner.
Just to make sure that new thinking doesn't mean has anything to do with the age of the thinker. But when we get to see new information, when we get to see new potentiality, and then we're able to act on it, that's kind of what we're talking about, this leapfrogging forward very quickly.
So just one more thing to add. I just kind of reiterate the point I made earlier, which is that I think there's a real role for the state to play in helping to fund efforts to sort of bring those different modelers or thought leaders together for those different approaches on one team. And not only that, but also to encourage, right now, a lot of the times the only way to make a living doing that kind of stuff is to have proprietary code, right? Unless there's another source of funding, a different type of source of funding that allows for more open and transparent development of some of these types of tools. So I think that goes along hand in hand with trying to kind of consensus build within the scientific community, and there's a real role for the state there.
All right. Any others? Oh, all right, Yelena. Oh, no. Oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you. I'm Alice Guinnessar from the League of Women Voters, and I'd like to thank the PPIC, first of all, for holding this conference because definitely the most urgent problem facing California and the next governor is our lack of water. And we can no longer rely on nature. I'd like to have anybody or all of you address especially when we really need emergency water, what kind of supplies can we get from developing more desalination plants or using the ones we have in a different way? Thank you.
I would just like to say that the infrastructure that gives you a chance to have a plan B, a backup system, a backup plan C system, is a part of a more robust way of looking at the predictability of changing climates or more predictable hot, dry weather. If we have an ability to manipulate supply and then wait and see how that manipulation is put into place based on the severity of any event, you will start to see a hierarchy of needs being thrown out there that, you wash, like we saw in Australia, you take baths less. You start to see all the water use, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in industry, whether it's in landscaping, whether it's with your pets. Everything starts to be put into a hierarchy, and basically we have to think that through. Is there a good or bad on that? There's plenty of good experiences around the world to tell you that it needs to be thought through ahead of time and not a scramble at the end.
Yeah, when we talk about affordability, it's such a key part of affordability is right sizing what your projects are and what you have. And so specifically to desal is a tool. It's out there. It can be part of a resiliency strategy. But to AG's point, it can't be an emergency response because if it's an emergency response, it means you're only ever going to use it in emergency, and it is incredibly expensive and I think irresponsible to your ratepayers to build that out if you're not. And we saw that with Australia. We've seen it in so far as San Diego or Santa Barbara's plant being mothballed after the last drought, and so and now back up again. So I think it's incredibly if we have to respond to a drought in an emergency fashion, it's already a bit too late. And so it feeds into this issue of planning, of greater sophistication and understanding of your watersheds, of the needs of and what to expect from your ratepayer base as well. Inland Utilities District, Inland Empire Utilities District. I thought I saw Martha Davis in the crowd, and her number one story is always about just the assumptions that the district had been operating under insofar as use, population, all that were just they were gross in estimates, and they weren't tied to what actual use is. And we know people are using less. We know homes are being built to greater standards. So, again, that level of sophistication is so important to be operating our systems in an affordable way because you have to right-size your projects. You can't overbuild. And again, you can't respond to a drought in an emergency fashion. If you are, it's a little too late.
All right, we have time for one more question. I'm going to turn over here because I feel like my back's been to you. In the back, right here.
Yeah, Kam Yargavechi, Department of Water Resources. Great panel, great event. Thank you all. In the spirit of collaboration and alignment, thinking about the different sectors of water management that we have and that each has worked in their own silos, has data and tools and optimized. From your organization's perspective, what could you do to help better advance the co-management of flood management, groundwater management, and ecosystem management?
So, as I would say, probably the largest water manager in the country, we are trying to change our decision-making process. The way the Corps developed, we've been around since they started navigation on the Mississippi, and it was very funnel-like. You did navigation, you did flood risk, you did ecosystem restoration much later in our history, and a little bit of water supply, but you didn't really talk between those two. And so what we're trying to do more of now is look at our projects holistically. California, my region is the leader in having large restoration, flood risk management projects working hand in hand. The South San Francisco Shoreline Project is ecosystem and flood risk management. We're working on our decision-making processes because we can only justify the project on one or the other, but we build the project as if you were justifying it as a whole. Hamilton City is another one, as well as Hamilton Airfields, again, in the Bay Area. We are trying to change our decision-making process because otherwise, if you're looking at a project only through one benefit stream, you really miss other collaborations that you can do. Like for instance, the Hamilton City, of course, we have a very difficult ability to partner with a nonprofit, but the Nature Conservancy is a big partner with the city and also with the state. They're all three contributing to how the project goes forward. So I think by changing our decision-making process, we should be able to be more inclusive of all the aspects that we can use water for. Unfortunately, we don't have any authority whatsoever to do groundwater recharge. We've supported it a little bit on the side, but our authorities are only given to us by Congress, and everybody has limits to what they can do, but that's one of the things that we have absolutely no ability to touch, except in sort of small grant authorities.
Do we still have? Go ahead.
So I guess I would just say, to the spirit of reaching across divides, and I think for the sake of considering resiliency for the state of California, I think EDF sort of approaches problem solving from the perspective that we really have to be able to kind of bridge some of these sort of more traditional divides between groups, especially in water management, and find ways to create solutions that, I mean, it sounds cliche and maybe impossible to some in the room, but that really are win-win. Especially when you think about Sigma or some of the challenges facing the state today. We're asking quite a bit of our agricultural partners, and I think there's a lot of really impressive local knowledge and creativity and willingness to do things in a new way out there. And so, we just have to do a better job of kind of approaching each other and approaching the challenge with a real sense of deference and respect for the knowledge that each party brings, and sort of broaden our definition of what sustainability means to try and include different value sets as best as we can. And that's a really maybe idealistic and pie-in-the-sky answer, but I do believe it's really critical.
And maybe to finish here, I'd like to do a shout out to Secretary Karen Ross at the Department of Ag, because she's been working collaboratively with the other agencies to basically look at agriculture as a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. And there's a lot of new tools then to look at soil health as more water retention, the ability to recharge aquifers through a little smarter process. We talk about climate smart agriculture is basically looking again at all these resources that we have to work with. And it is our food supply that is a part of this resource base, but looking for the dynamics that allow you to do what I said earlier, the 1 + 1 = 3, where you start to realize that there's a lot more we can be doing collaboratively, incentive-driven, and not pushed away or penalized or shut down just because of old thinking. So it's an exciting time, but more importantly, it comes with a need for everybody to gear up really with new thinking, new observations of what's possible. And believe it or not, it's moving forward pretty quickly. So again, thank you.
I think that's a perfect way to end our panels. Can I join me in thanking our panelists?